All right, this is part 2 of your lecture on chapters 19 and 20. This is going to begin with Roman numeral 3, applications of population ecology. So what can you do with the knowledge of a population? So you're a population ecologist, you have all this data on a certain population, but can you do with it? So here are some applications. Conservation ecology is really big. This is where you want to try and save animals from the brink of extinction. So animals who have very low numbers in the wild, they might be considered critically endangered or endangered. Maybe they have had a bottleneck event occur where their genetic diversity is very, very low. But you can find ways, or using the population ecology, you can help them try to recover in their numbers. This slide was taken from a genetic site where scientists can also use genetics in helping to organisms recover. So anyways, there's many fields that can work together with conservation ecology. So another application is just sustainable resource management. These are practices that allow the use of natural resources without damaging it and to replenish it. So if you think about what are some of the resources that we use, right? So humans are a big organism on the planet, very large population on the planet. What are some of our resources that are incredibly important to us in our survival? So water being one of them, right? So how can we use water sustainably? Okay, so these are some of the questions that science and ecologists are working on, is what's the best way to use resources, but in a sustainable way where we can use what we need, but also make sure that we're not damaging the resource so that future generations can also have that resource. And we're not damaging it, we're not taking it away, but we're replacing what we use. So water, for example, is a resource. Our soil, right, farmland is a resource. So there's lots of things, and if you think about, other organisms in terms of conservation ecology, they also have their resources, and so that you need to think about what are some ways we can sustainably have, their resources being used. So here's a sustainable resource management slide. This is the classic, so this is mainly for humans, but this is our reduce, reuse, recycle. This is the mantra that people have been using or saying for a while in order to be sustainable. Reduce, reuse, recycle. I know that we have pretty much settled on recycle or compost right now, that everybody knows to recycle. I'm sure you guys all recycle. If you have a can of soda or if you have a cardboard box, you don't throw it away in the trash, you put it into the recycling bin. And that's great. However, it's the third on the list, okay? What you really want to do if you want to make an impact on being sustainable is to reduce your waste, basically. So if you have the option of buying fruits individually versus fruits packaged up in a plastic box, go for the individual fruit, because you don't need that plastic box. That plastic box takes the fruit from the grocery store to your house, and then that's it, then you throw it away. So this is why there's a movement for, using your own grocery bags, because you're reducing the number of bags that you get at the grocery store, or even at like Target or something like that. You want to make sure you reduce. This is number one. This is the most impactful way that you can have a sustainable sort of behavior. Do you need something? Is it possible that you live without it? So not make sure, but if you want to be sustainable, think about what you buy and think about the packaging. If you don't need packaging, don't get it. Or if there's an alternative to like a biodegradable packaging, go for that. But reducing is the best. And then reuse, right? So if you have plastic bags, reuse them for another thing. A lot of the materials, sadly, are made for single use. I'm sure maybe some of you guys have heard of like single-use products, such as takeout containers, right? So if you go to a restaurant and you get a to-go container, you're only using that container once. It took lots of water to make it. It took tons of power to make that. You use it for literally about 10 minutes of your life, and then you throw it away in the trash where it's going to spend 1,000 years decomposing in a landfill. So think about reducing and reusing. Try not to, if you can, it's very, very difficult to always minimize single-use material, but if you can, try not to get single-use material. So if your coffee shop allows you to bring your own mug in, instead of getting one of those, cardboard to-go coffees, bring your own mug in, because every time you do that, you're saving the planet from another paper cup. That's, the job of the paper cup has lasted, it's, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, half an hour for you to drink the coffee, and then it's in the trash for 1,000 years. So try and minimize single-use things. That's why straws have been the bad poster child, right? You don't need a straw, and it's another one of those single-use items. I know some people have gotten metal straws if you really like a straw. And then there's recycle. So first reduce, don't buy it, don't get it. Then if you do, reuse it. And then if you reuse it and you can't reuse it anymore, then you recycle it or you compost it if you want to compost your fruits and vegetables. After recycling, then there's some recovery, right? So if you recover metals from that recycle bin or whatever, they can be reused again. And then, of course, the tip is we want to minimize as much disposal as possible. So this is waste management, but it's also a good way of just thinking about everything. You want to minimize your footprint on the planet to make yourself sustainable, to make the earth sustainable so that our future generations are not dealing with, 100,000 tons of coffee cups, which I'm sure that's out there anyway. All right, let's look at letter C, invasive species. So knowing how population ecology works can inform us on how to, on the dangers of invasive species. So what's an invasive species? It is a non-native species. What that means is that it is an organism. It can be a plant, it can be an animal that did not evolve in a certain area. So it was brought over to an area to kind of, it was introduced to an area. If it was a plant, let's say that someone thought an Australian bush was super beautiful. They got the seeds and they started to grow it in Los Angeles, right? That bush in Australia did not evolve in Los Angeles. So what that means is in Australia, when things evolve together, there is a network of pressures, like those limiting capacity things, that keeps the growth of a plant or keeps the growth of an animal in check, so that you don't have overgrowth because they're natural predators or there's a natural pathogen. There's some kind of limiting factor that keeps the population down and in check. But if you take that plant and pop it over to Los Angeles, where there's absolutely no predator or herbivore or pest, everything is new to this plant, the plant has none of its normal limiting capacity features, and so it can overgrow wildly and then take over the habitats of the native plants in the area, and that can disrupt food webs, it can disrupt the ecosystem, it can disrupt a lot of these delicate balances that nature has in a certain area. So that's what non-native species is. Non-native did not evolve in a certain area. And when you introduce a non-native species into a new area, you can have overgrowth that can cause really detrimental environmental or economic damage. I have a couple of examples here. So there's this invasive water snake introduced to California. Sometimes people just like exotic snakes and they'll just get them as pets, and then for some reason they'll decide they don't want the pet anymore and they'll just toss it outside into the world, and then their population starts to boom. So southern water snakes commonly eat mole salamanders in a group that includes 2 endangered species in California. So UC Davis study found that the non-native snakes are invading California waters, posing a threat to native fish, amphibians, and reptiles. So this non-native snake is really just eating its way through this ecosystem. This is a kind of grass that's also invasive, the Pampas grass. I'll just read the highlighted things here. So it was introduced to Santa Barbara by a nursery, and it was threatening. It's spread all over the state. It can produce millions of seeds every year, and they can travel for miles. It's very, very hardy, this plant. It's tolerant to intense sun, to drought, to frost, and they can grow anywhere. So because these things are so fast growing and they can grow anywhere, they actually displace native plants. So they can take up the territory of the native plants. They change the habitat, and they basically lower biodiversity. So what that means is that if you have, what biodiversity means, and I'm sure you guys have an idea, is that in a certain area you have a diverse amount of living things. So you have different kinds of insects and different kinds of plants and different kinds of animals, very diverse living things. But then when you get an invasive species, that tends to overtake completely an area, and it will lower the biodiversity. So let's say this plant takes over, you're going to absolutely see the lower biodiversity in the plants, but you also might see a lower biodiversity in the insects, because the insects that were living on a diverse group of plants has now been replaced by one plant, and those insects might not like that one plant. So you're going to see a lower biodiversity when you have invasive species come in. This is also a kudzu vine. This is extremely invasive, so you can see just by the picture how the vine is everywhere. And this is going to get into our letter D. What can you do about these biological species? So, or these invasive species? You could, physically cut those down. You can use chemicals to poison plants and, chemicals. But another aspect that has been used and is still being used is something called biological control of pests. Sorry, this is the slide. So biological control is using an organism to control the overgrowth of another organism. So you can see this ladybug-ish character eating an aphid. There are side effects though, right? As you would imagine, if you wanted to unleash a living thing to take care of your problem, you might have unintended other problems. So you could have attacks on non-target species. When you introduce something that's alive, you can't control it. You don't know what it's going to do, and so it can have all these unintended consequences on a certain area. It can also target native species, so you don't know what you're going to get. So you have to be very controlled with biological pest control. But the pro for this would be like you won't have chemicals that leach into the soil or that will stay in that environment and maybe damage unwanted organisms as well. So if you put like a weed killer, that weed killer might also kill insects, and it might also kill the animals that eat those insects because of that poison. So this kind of gets around the whole chemical building up, the biomagnification and bioaccumulation of toxins by using living things, but it's also a little bit scary because you don't know what the living things will actually do in the long run. All right, so let's talk about the next section here, ecological footprint, which is here, our ecological footprint. What is our ecological footprint? It is the estimate of the amount of land required to provide the raw materials that an individual or a nation consumes, including your food, the fuel, water, housing, waste disposal. So basically, how much land do you need to give you all the things that you require for your life? Okay, that's your ecological footprint. So the ecological footprint for the United States is around 22 acres per person. Okay, that's almost twice what we can support, twice what the US land and resource can support. When you have a very large ecological footprint, what that means is you are requiring the planet to give you more things. So you're using a lot of water, using a lot of food that might be very intense on the planet to grow that food, and perhaps you are buying a lot of products, plastic waste, things like that. So the energy that's put into making an iWatch or an iPhone, the next iPhone, or whatever it is that you need, right? There's energy, there's waste in every product. And so all the products out there have an ecological footprint. So the ecological impact of affluent nations, affluent means rich, is a problem of overconsumption and overpopulation. Compared to a family in rural India, Americans have an abundance of possessions. How does an individual's large ecological footprint affect Earth's carrying capacity, right? So if you think about that, Earth, the planet, definitely has a carrying capacity. Have we reached it? I don't know. We'll see. But humans have had a role in really changing the surface of the planet, and we are demanding a lot of our planet. We're demanding a lot of water. We're demanding a lot of energy, a lot of resources, a lot of food. And so if you have a very large ecological footprint, how does that affect Earth's carrying capacity? Well, it's probably going to lower the carrying capacity, right? If every individual needs a lot of resources from the Earth, then the Earth just can't sustain that many people. So the carrying capacity of the Earth will be lower if everybody needs a lot of the Earth's footprint, right? Or a lot of the Earth's resources. This is a picture of a typical house. I think they brought all their stuff outside. And it's pretty typical. If you look around, there's nothing like crazy excessive that, it does look like a lot. But I think everybody realizes how much stuff they have when they have to move, right? You think you might not have a lot of stuff, and then you have to pack it all up, and then you realize, oh my gosh, I have a lot of stuff. So this is, the stuff that this family needs or they think they need, and every item in there is going to have some kind of impact on the Earth, right? So if you want to have a smaller ecological footprint, you also want to think about, like, what do you need in your life and what you don't need to consume in your life. And of course, the less you consume, the smaller your ecological footprint. And this is not just stuff, it can be energy, like just turning off some lights in your house. If you're not using a room and the light's on, just turn it off. That's being sustainable. It's being ecologically conscious because you're not using that energy. So this is just our ecological footprint by country in 2018. So you can see we're in the darker red. We are the larger of our footprint, in terms of countries with a footprint, right? We're in there with the large footprint. And that was it. So I just want to talk about, so you guys should just know what is your ecological footprint, how you can lower your ecological footprint on the planet. And chapter 20 is going to begin with these interspecific interactions. So chapter 20 is about, the first part here is about community ecology. So remember what a community was? A community is all the organisms in a certain area, not just one species. So population is one species of organism, but a community is all of the living things within an area. So now we're looking at what are some relationships between different species. So now we have the word interspecific interactions or interspecific competition. And this is between species. Intra, right? We had that word earlier. Intraspecific means within that one species. So interspecific in a competition when two populations in a community compete for a common resource. So it turns out that there is a rule there called the competitive exclusion principle. It states that there are two species that share an ecological niche. This word can be pronounced niche or niche, but what this is just a very small aspect of a larger environment. So if you were looking at, just like a woods scenario, so there's lots of different kind of smaller parts of the woods. So there might be the base or a hole in an oak tree, right? Or some kind of space within the bark of a tree. That's a niche. Not all birds or organisms will want that specific living situation, but there will be some competition for that living space. So that's a niche. So if you have two organisms that are competing for that same niche, they cannot coexist. So one is going to outcompete the other one. Let's actually look at this picture first. So This is a picture of two species of paramecium, and the red line is Paramecium aurelia, and the blue line is Paramecium caudatum. And if you grew them separately in different cultures, then look at their growth curves, very similar, right? They both go up in population and they have this carrying capacity. If you grew them together in the same petri dish, what happens? What happened to our blue line? It got destroyed. So Paramecium aurelia outcompeted Paramecium caudatum. So this is that exclusion principle, excuse me. So they share the same ecological niche, but they cannot coexist. They don't follow the same growth curve. They can't both be happy in that same niche. One will always outcompete the other one. Okay, so now let's look at the types of synergism that's in your outline. So in terms of two different species living in the same area, they have a relationship with each other. And so synergism is just a word about living together. So synergistic relationships is living together. It doesn't mean good. And that's how it's used a lot in sort of common everyday language. They'll say like, oh, they have a synergistic relationship, meaning that it's good, they both benefit from each other, but not all the way. So these are types of synergism, types of relationships you have when you're living with another species. So mutualism is this plus plus for both parties. So both, each plus represents like the organism. So we have, let's say, plants and their pollinators, like a plant and a bee, right? The bee gets a benefit from the plant. It gets nectar to make honey. And then the plant gets a benefit from the bees by being pollinated. So there's a plus-plus relationship here where both members of this relationship are benefited. So that's called mutualism. Predation and herbivory are kinds of relationships, and also parasite pathogen, where one member of that relationship is being harmed. So predation, obviously, the predator is benefited because it eats the prey. The prey is being harmed. Herbivory, same thing except plants, right? The herbivore, the animal that eats the plant, is getting benefit. The plant is getting consumed, so bad for the plant. Parasite pathogen, the parasite or the pathogen is getting benefited from this relationship because they have a host to live off of, or they're making somebody sick. The host is going to be negatively affected in this relationship. So just remember that the word synergism does not mean mutualism. Mutualism is a plus-plus relationship, but synergism just means living together. Okay, so in your notes, after we talked about that, we have mutualism, and then we have predation, and then these are ways to avoid predation. So let's take a look at these. So how to avoid predation. There's many fun tricks that the animal kingdom has, and also plant, to hide themselves in ways. So cryptic coloration is hiding, and warning coloration is not hiding, it's actually standing out. So let's look at cryptic coloration. Cryptic coloration means camouflage, a way to hide from predators. So if you take a look at this cryptic coloration slide, there's animals in every picture, and sometimes they're easier to spot than others, but there's a lizard here that really blends in with the bark of the tree. The owl looks just like the bark of a tree as well. The ghost crab has a coloration just like the sand here, and then the ibex, their coloration matches their environment perfectly. So there's an ibex here, there's an ibex here, a baby one, there's another ibex right here. I think that's it. I think there's 3. Yeah. All right, so that's cryptic coloration, to blend in with your environment. And then there's the opposite method, which is warning coloration, which means that you're going to be brightly colored, standing out very well from your environment, but it's a warning to others. It's saying, see me, I'm poisonous, don't eat me, right? So this is a recognition for their prey, to recognize them, to remember them because they're poisonous. So that's warning coloration. And so this dart frog, for example, is very, very poisonous, and an animal that eats it will die. Skunks, of course, their coloration is to warn you that they have that really bad smell. These guys taste bad, and this cinnabar moth caterpillar is also poisonous. So then you have mimicry, Where mimicry is where an edible species will mimic a poisonous one, or mimics another animal to keep from being eaten or to enhance mating. So this is the viceroy butterfly. This is the mimic. This evolved to look very, very similar to the monarch butterfly. So these two are going to inhabit the same area, right? So why does the viceroy butterfly look like the monarch? Because they're both in the same area. The monarch is brightly colored and it's poisonous, so it's the model. So if a bird eats the monarch butterfly, it will spit it out, it tastes horrible, and it's going to stay away from the viceroy because the viceroy looks exactly like monarch. So that's a mimic. These nudibranch pictures, these are sea slugs, and I honestly can't remember which one's the mimic and which one's the poisonous one, but you can see they're very close. These two are very, very close in appearance. One is edible and one is not. And then this is a moth that is trying to look like a spider. I guess these little offshoots look like spider legs, but that's another trick to mimic a spider, mimic another organism. Here are insects that look like other things to hide, right, from being predated. This is going to look like a leaf. Here's a very typical leaf bug, a stick bug. And then this is a fun one. This is a bird dropping spider. So this spider exudes a substance that makes it look like bird dropping. So no one in their right mind is going to eat this because it's basically a pile of bird dropping. All right. So these are some tricks that animals have to avoid predation. But how about plants? How do plants avoid herbivory? So defenses that plants have, there's many, and these are the obvious physical ones: thorns, spines, prickly parts, things that hurt the animal or the herbivore when they're getting eaten. So spines, thorns, hairs on leaves. And then there are chemicals. So chemicals, right, these are a list of some chemicals that are made by plants. And they don't actually help the plant in any way to grow, but they do help the plant taste nasty. They can make the plant taste bad. They can actually be toxic to the herbivore. They can disrupt the herbivore's life cycle. So these are just, defense mechanisms that plants have. So we have actually used a lot of these defense mechanisms in our food, right? Because we think they taste good or they perk us up like caffeine. Strychnine is the substance in rat poison. So that comes from this plant right there. All right, so this brings us to letter F, where it says trophic levels. So you want to know your trophic levels. Troph means to feed, so these are feeding levels. And the first trophic level is going to be the organisms that get their energy from the sun. So these are also called the producers. The second trophic level is the one that's going to feed on the primary first trophic level. So the secondary trophic level is going to be our herbivores, right? They're going to feed on the plants, the producers. The third trophic level is going to be our consumers. So this is going to be eat, all right, and so on and so forth. The fourth trophic level eats the third trophic level. You can look at these words in parentheses. So the primary level here, your producers, they're called producers because they're going to produce the sugars, the organic molecules for the planet. So they harness the energy from the sun, making the organics for the rest of the trophic levels. So the primary consumers eat the producers, the secondary consumers eat the primary consumers, the tertiary consumers eat the secondary consumers. And then there's the decomposers, right? The decomposers are going to be your bacteria and fungi, and they're going to break down every single trophic level. So really, the decomposers will sometimes sit at the very top of the pyramid because the decomposers are going to decompose everything. So I want you guys to make sure that there's also the omnivores. The omnivores will eat both plants and animals, so they can eat at different trophic levels. And so this is just one way of looking at, this is a simplified way of looking at where organisms get their energy, right? These different trophic levels. In reality, we have food webs, but this is basically a picture of a food chain, both a terrestrial food chain, so on land, and an aquatic food chain in the water. Producers are photosynthetic, right? They're going to be the plants and they're going to be phytoplankton. The primary consumers are going to eat your producers, so they're considered herbivores because they're going to eat plant matter. So these will be zooplankton in the water, or maybe an insect. Then our secondary consumers will eat the primary consumers. So we could have a mouse eating an insect. We have larger fish eating the zooplankton. Then we have tertiary consumers that consume our secondary consumers, and then we have our quaternary consumers. So we don't really have a fifth or sixth level consumer. As I'll explain, there's an energy loss with every level that you go up. So there's not enough energy on the planet to give rise to another energy level, or another consumer trophic level here. So let's understand a food web. A food web is a collection of all your food chains in an ecosystem, and food webs can change over time, and real food webs have animals that eat maybe their own predators or other organisms. It's a mixed up trophic level. So let's take a look at a food web, right? So now we can see that it's a little bit more complicated than just one straight line that goes from producer to tertiary consumer or quaternary consumer, but it's more interconnected. So let's talk about the energy pyramid. When energy flows as organic matter through the trophic levels of an ecosystem, much of it is lost at each link in the food chain. So remember energy, there's different kinds of energy, kinetic energy and potential energy, and organic matter has this potential energy, right? It has the potential energy in the molecules of the protein or in the carbohydrate. So it turns out that there is something called the 10% rule. So let's look at the picture here. So every trophic level that you go up, the upper level only gets 10% of the energy within its body. Let me see if I can find a picture here. In this example, the caterpillar uses 15 kilocalories to store in his body from the leaf. This means that 85% of the calories are lost as heat or as waste. So when the caterpillar is feeding on this primary trophic level, right, this is the producer, the amount of calories in this leaf, only 10% approximately will be stored and found in the caterpillar. Where did the other 90% go? Well, when the caterpillar eats the molecules here, you're going to use some of those calories for running your chemical reactions, right, for cellular respiration. Then you're going to lose a lot that's undigested. There's heat that's being lost as well. And then there's 15 kilocalories for growth. So out of that whole leaf, the caterpillar is only going to get about 15 kilocalories to put in its own body. That means that 15 kilocalories out of that leaf is going to be available to the next trophic level that eats the caterpillar, right? So the caterpillar is only going to store 10% of the previous energy in its body. So for the upper trophic level that eats the caterpillar, only 10% of that leaf energy is getting passed on. Okay, so let's take a look at this. So the 10% rule, here's our producers. So our plants available, like the amount of energy that's available in this plant is going to be 10,000 kilocalories, okay? So remember, kilocalorie is the same as capital C calorie. So this is 10,000 calories, big C calories, in this area where all the plants are. So if you ate all the plants, you get 10,000 calories. The grasshopper, right, is only 10% of the energy of the plants will be harnessed in the grasshopper. The grasshopper, its trophic level, the primary consumer, is only going to be 10% of the producer level. Hopefully that makes sense. The energy that's in the grasshopper is only 10% of the energy found in the producer level. So the grasshopper has 1,000 calories, right? So it's only 10% of the 10,000 because we lost 90%. So this is the 10% rule. So the grasshoppers will have about 1,000 calories stored in its body and available for the next trophic level. The mouse is only going to have 100 calories, and another 10% is available at the snake. So what this means is the higher up you go in trophic levels, the top consumers are going to need to have a lot more area to maintain the amount of energy it needs, because the energy that it gets is only 10 calories from this whole field of flowers. So if the snake, that means that the snake needs to look around and have a wider area for searching for food, because this is not enough to sustain it, right? This little plot of diagram land is not enough calories to sustain the snake. Another way of looking at this here, oh, I guess I don't have another way of looking at it, but I hope you understand that. So as a general rule, when you go up in trophic level, the energy, only 10% of the available energy is passed on to the next trophic level. So this is the reason why there aren't many more trophic levels, because you have a drastic energy loss. Because every time you go up in trophic level, you get less and less energy available to it. Let's take a look at biomagnification. So you had a video of this in your lab that talked about biomagnification. So let's say there's some mercury from coal plants that are produced. So we have methyl mercury in the atmosphere. The methyl mercury gets into the water system, and the methyl mercury affects the krill. The krill is eaten by salmon, it's eaten by trout, it's even eaten by bigger fish. Look at the mercury levels. Mercury level EPA advice for consumption. The mercury level in each food chain goes up because of biomagnification. This fish needs to eat a lot of krill, right? So there might be a tiny bit of mercury in each one of these small krill, but because this salmon eats a lot of krill throughout its lifetime, this salmon gets the toxin from all of those krill it's eaten for its lifetime. Then this trout only needs to eat one salmon in order to get all that toxin. So this trout's not only going to eat one salmon, it's going to eat many, many salmon. So each salmon it eats will have a little bit of mercury, and that's going to get magnified in the trout. The trout's going to be much more poisonous than the salmon because the trout's higher up on the food chain, and it's going to get magnified. The toxin is going to get magnified in its body. And then another level up, right, this shark or albacore tuna or halibut that's on the upper trophic level, it will have the most mercury because it's going to eat the fish that have been biomagnified. This methyl mercury has been magnified every time you go up in the food chain, and so finally this shark, every meal it gets is more poisonous, and so it's going to accumulate over a lifetime lots and lots of poisonous fish, and then that methyl mercury will be accumulated in its body. This is happening to the point where the EPA actually tells you not to eat too much of these large fish. Eat only a few times per month of your halibut, shark, pike, and albacore because their bodies have so much mercury in it. Women who are pregnant should not eat these fish because the mercury can have damaging effects to the fetus. You should eat trout or tuna a few times a week. You don't need to worry about these because there's just not enough mercury in their bodies. So the lower on the food chain, the better to eat on, because the toxin in the environment has not bioaccumulated, right? You still have just small amounts of the toxin in those smaller fish, in the smaller, the lower trophic levels. All right, so our last topic here. So before moving on, the ecosystem, energetics, and human resources use. So of course, we are part of a food web and food chain. The dynamics of energy flow apply to the human population as much as it does to other organisms. The human population has less energy available to it when we eat higher trophic levels than when we eat as primary consumers. So let's take a look at this graph here. So we have this scenario where we have our producers, we have our plants, and then we have our primary consumers, the cattle, right? So how much energy do the cattle get from those corn? 10%, right? And if we are going to eat the cattle, then how much energy from this corn do we get, right? We get 1%. So when we eat lower on the food chain, so if we were vegetarians and we skipped the cattle, you have more energy available to you, right? You have the same biomass, all this corn. There's a lot of energy here that can actually feed a lot of people. Oops. A lot of vegetarians, if you eat lower on the food chain, there's more energy available to you. However, if you eat higher up on the food chain, so if you want to eat an herbivore, for example, you are demanding more energy from the planet because you will need more than just this sort of 1% of the producers. So, an argument for being gentle on the planet and to be sustainable is to choose food that is going to make you eat lower on the food chain. So, I'm not asking or telling you to be a vegetarian. I am not a vegetarian myself, but it is better for the planet if you don't eat a lot of meat. Cattle, for example, are very water intensive, they're land intensive, and so it takes a lot of energy to grow one cow, a lot of corn, a lot of production to grow one cow, and then you have that steak, which you could have had, the same amount of calories coming from plants. So it's easier on the environment for people to eat lower on the food chain. And I think that's all I had for the energy pyramids. And then my last thing was conservation biology. Conservation biology is goal-oriented science to understand and counter the loss of biodiversity. I mentioned a little bit before what biodiversity is, but I'd like you guys to read page 446 in your book on the process of science and the importance of biodiversity, and there'll be a couple questions about that in your final exam. Okay, so to wrap things up, we have some questions here. So the concept of trophic level or trophic structures emphasizes what? Vegetarianism is more prevalent, keystone species concept, feeding relationships within a community, or species richness in the community. So trophic level is feeding level, so that's letter C. Match organism to trophic level. We have algae, grasshopper, eagle, and fungus. So algae is photosynthetic, so this is going to be our producer, letter B. Grasshoppers are herbivores, they're going to be a primary consumer. Eagles are going to be our secondary consumer in this choice group. And then fungus is a decomposer. And then lastly, an example of a mutualism or mutualistic relationship plus plus is it going to be corals and unicellular algae, cryptic coloration of frogs, herbivory, or a relationship between two warblers which use the same resources, and that should be letter A, plus plus, the corals and the algae that live within the bodies of the corals. They have a mutualistic beneficial relationship. Right, and that's it.